un escalier droit, une vieille mansarde, et me voilà chez moi. Un lit qui se gondole, une table de guingois, une lampe à pétrole, et me voilà chez moi. Mais le soir quand le cafard me pénètre, et que mon cœur est partout malheureux, j'écarte les rideaux de ma fenêtre et j'écarquille les yeux. De l'autre côté de la rue, il y a une fille, et même le...
Millions of people took part in the struggle against the Nazi attempt to enslave the world. Henri Korb was one of those who took part in that struggle. Over 50 million people died in the Second World War. 6 million Jews were murdered. Henri was born of Jewish parents in Budapest, Hungary. When he was 3 years old, his family fled to Strasbourg, France, because of the anti-Semitism of the fascist government in Hungary.
Strasbourg was, and still is to some extent, a bicultural city where German was understood. The Alsatian dialect is basically German, like Schweizerdeutsch. So a little bit of Yiddish, a little bit of German, you could get along, and one could make a living without knowing French, although French was also spoken.
And you went to school there?
And I started there in a Jewish refugee schools where different age groups were all mixed up in one little school, and overcrowded. You know, we hardly got some attention. I spent probably from between age 6 to 10. I just wasted. Practically, we learned nothing. Took some courses in a national school which teach chronometry, the Institute of Chronometry. I was meant for that, but I changed my mind, and I passed some exams, and I managed to be accepted in an engineering school in Paris. And that's where I spent 3 or 4 years for my degree. And that was intensive study, and I was eager to get a piece of paper and make a living. I did not want to be dependent. You know, France and Europe in general did not offer as many opportunities for teenagers to make some pocket money. Although I was, you know, in my early age, I was a choir boy at the synagogue. I earned my keep between 6 and 13. But there were no McDonald's or supermarkets where you could be a bagger or something. Kids didn't have much opportunity to make a living, to make some money.
What type of engineering did you take?
I got a degree in electromechanical engineering. Yeah, then the question was, what am I going to do? Am I going to take maybe a postgrad? I had in mind maybe to take a postgraduate year in some engineering school, which would have helped me a lot later on. But I just couldn't afford it, and I couldn't. There were no opportunities like part-time, evening, and this and that. Either it's full-time and you have the money, or or else. So it didn't work out, and so therefore I canceled my military deferment. At that time, the compulsory service at that time was 2 years, 2 years regular service. So I said I want to get this out of my way, and then I'll start life at fresh. So in October of 1937, I entered the military service. I happened to be in a center before the war was declared. I was sent there in a place called Neufchâteau in the Vosges Mountains. I was detached from my unit, from my regiment. In the meantime, war broke out. I was drafted from that center into another center where they were forming a unit, an expeditionary corps to the Middle East. And I was checked medically. I had good teeth. My heart was okay. I remember they checked. And I was say, bon pour le service. I was designated to be part of the expeditionary corps for the Middle East, which later became a corps of some 100,000 men. And it was late, still during the Phoney War, late in the fall of 1939, that we left Marseille for Beirut. We landed in Lebanon and Syria, where I stayed there for 13 months. During that time, France was overrun by the Germans. When France fell, we in the colonies, Syria and Lebanon, I should say, it was not a colony, to be correct, it was a mandate, a French mandate. But there were, the substantial forces in North Africa and in Indochina and so forth. We did not know which way to go. We waited for orders. We didn't know who would give us the orders. So the Vichy orders came in. Very, very, very strong. Anybody who does not submit, court-martial and death penalty. It's desertion in time of war. But in spite of that, I remember we were a little group among very few we already saw that there was no future with Vichy, and we wanted to see ways of joining the Free French forces, which at that time were in Lower Egypt. In order to reach them from Lebanon, we had to go to what at that time was called Palestine. The idea appealed to me very much, although there was a death penalty involved and some were caught. I was torn between the need. I say, what do I do? That war is going to last many years. When I'm going to come back, I may not find anybody alive. And here I have a chance to see my family. That was one turn in my life. I did not know what to do. I wanted to see my family, and I wanted to fight against the Germans. But there was an order waiting for me. I was embarked on a ship to go to France. I didn't have to decide. And I didn't resist that. I said, I want to see my family. And so I landed in Marseille. That was in December of 1940. I was 24 years old. And then I joined my family, who was refugee in Périgueux. They were evacuated from their hometown Strasbourg from the beginning of the war, 1939, because Strasbourg was declared an open city. The city was literally empty, except for a few gendarmes. So I found my family there. They were all alive and reasonably well. This was completely at a standstill. All the bridges were blown up. The railway system was entirely destroyed, and if you know the railways in Europe, and in France in particular, was the nerve of the economy. No plants, no jobs. The unemployment was possibly 99.9%. Everybody was out of a job. That was the situation. There was a school formed in a little town near Lyon called La Côte Saint-André. That town is known, it happens to be the birthplace of Hector Berlioz, the famous French composer, which I later discovered. And that's where they taught us land surveying. The Marshal already was preaching retour à la terre, back to the earth. This was his motto. We didn't have anything else to do, go back to the earth. What could intellectuals do? Survey the land. And so I learned surveying and topography. Because the news were filled up, the comments in the papers, headlines, and the orders were from the Ministry of Education to devote some of the time to educate people about the causes of our defeat. Not only did we get technical, we got some indoctrination from Vichy. And what were the causes of our defeat? And it rings in my mind. les Juifs, les communistes et les francs-maçons. The Jews, the communists, and the Freemasons. But 6 months have passed since, and the industry started to pick up gradually, and this is when I first got my first job as a junior engineer in Lyon. That was late, probably in the fall of 1941. So I moved to Lyon and I said goodbye to topography for the time being. I was in Lyon in a big company, as a matter of fact, the Franco-American Bell Company, associated with the American Bell Company. We were in the business of designing rectifiers for battery chargers and so on, selenium rectifiers. I was there until the law of compulsory labor came out in France, was spelled out STO, Service du Travail Obligatoire, Service of Compulsory Labor. I found myself on the list to go to Germany. That was a big turning point in my life. I didn't believe in going. I didn't know how I would wind up this war, but I said that if I ever wind up in Germany, I'm not going to walk by myself. I'm going to be dragged. And so I had only one thing to do. I left my job, in which in French you say, j'ai donné ma démission. I gave up. I gave notice. There was no law about giving notice. They didn't know what my intentions were. As long as I switched to another job where they could get me, that's fine. But I gave notice. And the moment I did not reintegrate another job, that made me already consider as being illegal. I was sort of underground without being actively underground. I was a passive resistance. The Allied forces, when they debarked in November 1942 in North Africa, in Algeria and Morocco. This was the signal for the Germans to march down into the so-called, until then, unoccupied zone of France and occupy it. The French Navy, who was then in Toulon, which is on the Mediterranean, had a last drive for honor, and they blew themselves up rather than to surrender to the Germans. That was the famous sabotage in Toulon in the fall of 1942. In the meantime, I went back to Périgueux to see my family. The situation became very tense. Jews were being grabbed right and left. My family then consisted of, I had my father, my sister, and brother-in-law with their 3 children, and there were other friends. We all lived in a little house which we had rented in Périgueux. My brother, who joined me from Paris, he himself was running a hotel restaurant near Paris, and was somebody gave him away as being Jewish, and he had to run away. And so we decided, we say, we are 2 men, let's make some sense out of our lives. At least if we have to, let's fight for our lives. And the only way to fight was to try to join the Free French forces in North Africa. And so that we decided to try to cross the Spanish border illegally. In December of that same year, in 1942, my brother and I, along with the 3 children of my sister, we decided to cross the border of Spain illegally. This is where we crossed in December of 1942, deep in the snow, across the Pyrenees, at a point, at the French border point called Bourg-Madame, and we landed on the other side in the Spanish town of Puigcerdà, where we spent 48 hours in prison without a drop of water, let alone food. we were refoulés to France, sent back by force by 6 guards to France at that time, after having spent a rough time with the German Gestapo. So there were four Gestapo people. 2 took me in charge and 2 for my brother. We were questioned in 2 separate rooms. One was here, right to me. I remember another one was sitting at the table with his feet dangling. Okay, then they wanted to, they wanted to scare me. I knew what the Gestapo meant. I knew about the camps and I knew all that. But in my mind, you should not be scared. Well, if we don't, I wanted to convey the idea that I'm not scared of them, not because I'm so strong. If you are down and scared, they get you. That means that you know a lot, you have heard a lot, you know about the camps. I wanted to appear as a guy who does not know about these things, but and yet come across as believable. They looked at me. I saw the skull and the bone. They have that on their lapel of their uniform. Say, you know what the German Gestapo is in German? They asked me. Of course, the questioning was in German. I say Gestapo. I say yes. They say, well, you are an intelligent. You have education and so on. I mean, you know what's going on. Yeah, I know what Gestapo stands for. And I spelled it out, Geheime Staatspolizei, secret states police. Yeah, that stimmt. He says, that's right. But do you know our methods? That's exactly what he asked me. I said, what methods? Do you know what we can send you to places? I say, yeah, well, he said, sure, well, I'm not afraid to walk. I walked all my life. That's what I said. I walked all my life. Yes, he said, but there are places, that was in 42, where one does not come back from. This I heard from my own ears. Well, of course, they have a Gestapo, they knew. And then he turned around and he picked up a snapshot which was on the floor. It was a passport snapshot of a man who had a vague smile in his face. Hey, you see that Jew? Der lacht nicht mehr. He doesn't smile anymore. And situation being what it was in transition, they surrendered us back to the French authorities. The gendarmes then gave us over to the Vichy Justice Department. We landed in a town, in a city called Perpignan, which is quite a sizable city in the Pyrenees. And that's where we were condemned for 1 month's prison and confiscation of whatever francs we had for having crossed that border illegally. That was the motive. Having crossed the border illegally and exported with exported funds. Exportation des capitaux. We were about a dozen in one big cell. Cement and straw, nothing else. Some straw. And we were sleeping there. It didn't take long. In a day or two, we were all covered with lice. I never knew such huge lice I have seen there. This was my obsession. When I came in to that prison, just to tell you, I was hungry. We hadn't had 48 hours, anything to eat or sleep. We had maybe a drink in between. The first meal they served us in an ugly military casserole with layers of dirt which has never been washed. And there was some kind of what looked like rotten potatoes and something. And as I looked and I hesitated, I was hungry and wanted, I saw dozens of eyes watching me because they were hungry. They knew I wouldn't dare. I wouldn't eat it. I am fresh. And as I made a move, not to want it, they were fighting over it. This imposition, this degradation of mankind, this is what I resented. I say, look, give me prison, but don't make an animal out of me. And I don't think that the conditions were much worse than in the worst camps, except at the camps it was hopeless.
After a month in prison, Henry and his brother were freed. Henry found a surveying job and was able to get his brother hired as his helper. They started to live and work illegally using false documents.
When we talk about underground, the beginning of underground really to speak of, the Jews were always underground, but the beginning of gradual active underground became after the Germans run down in late 42 and in 43, when people started to pile up who resisted being sent to Germany. They had no way but hide. And the French call them les réfractaires, those who resisted going to Germany. I had contact with some elements there. I gave them some little sketches where the Germans would dig ditches to protect themselves in case of aerial attack and so on. And some elements of the underground wanted to know the location of these sketches, so I provided them this with it. And eventually, close to the D-Day, when the first bombs fell in my area, I remember the bridge blew up just less than a mile from where I was, and somebody was killed who was near the bridge. I saw the Germans running like wild along the highway. I was in a little hotel in a place called, my headquarters was Rochemort. One morning we woke up, my brother and I, and sat right down, looked through the windows. There were some les volets, these window covers. We saw Germans with machine guns on their belly, ready to shoot. They were probably hassled by some elements, and we had to go out. At that time, if we left that hotel at that time, they grab any man. They probably were attacked by some elements. And so we waited. When this went by, we said, well, Charles, I say, this is that we have to run. We left everything as it is. We crossed the highway and went straight up the mountains. And we went as far as we could until we met the first underground element. It happened to be a group called FTPF, which was a partisan French. Incidentally, partisan, they were associated with, they were communist in spirit. But at that time, I was only interested in one kind of people, those I had something in common. Those who want to fight the Germans were good enough for me. And I joined them. I had to change my identity. I remember my name was Babilas.
What does that mean?
Babilas. Well, they asked me to pick a name, and I looked through names and said, what the heck? Then I remembered when I was a little, the youngest of my family, they called me Booby. I was a boy, Booby. So I say Babilas. I say Babilas is my name. We are south of Valence, and Valence is south of Lyon. That you can find on the map. And the capital of the département is the equivalent to a county here. France had 48 départements or something divided. The département Ardèche, the capital was Aubenas, A-U-B-E-N-A-S, Aubenas. Not very well known among tourists. Yeah, we found two of our colleagues. Yeah, our command let it somehow know to the German commandatur that if they did not, the Germans let it know that they don't make any prisoners of underground people, they just shoot them. So to have some leeway, some leverage on them, we managed to catch some individual Germans. People at night, maybe a drunkard, poor guy left some wandering around, surrounded by a few, dragged up in the mountain, and they were kept. We had maybe half a dozen or so of them. And we let the commandatur know, for every man of ours you kill, we will kill 3. To give some leeway. And sure enough, A short while after, they brought back 2 of ours who were cut in pieces. Ugly description, you know. Sexual parts cut off and all this kind of thing. Of course, the tempers were very, very wild, and we had to execute our threat to make it valid. And here were these, I must say, these poor isolated Germans who were there. They were there already, you know, they were peeling potatoes, they were making themselves. They were ordinary Germans, they were the Reichswehr. They were not, you know, you couldn't pick the ones you want to, you know, you couldn't find the Gestapos when you wanted. You wanted just Germans for French. That shows you the ugly part of the war. We had these poor 6 there. 3 were lined up in front. There were a bunch of guys all around. You know, not everybody. One had a gun, one had a Sten, machine gun, one had a rifle. You know, the odd underground thing. I was 10 feet away. I never saw this in my life. I understood these poor guys, what they were pleading for their lives. They say, we are not Nazis, we are from, one said, I am from Bayern, and he tried to, what is this, what do you want? I mean, why? And they started shooting. It was the ugliest sight I ever saw. You know, I only saw dead people through Hollywood movies, like it's nice and clean. You shoot and you fall, and somebody falls down, it doesn't move anymore, it's clean. But here, you know, when I remember these pictures, you know, some of them apparently even they were hit in the arteries. I saw the blood, you know, just geysers of blood coming out, and one struggling on the ground and begging, give me another one. You know, he was suffering too much. You know, I'm still sick when I think of that. Of course, I did not. At least I did not feel like I did not participate. I just watched that, but I couldn't. I had a bad taste of the war and of the whole thing. I would not mind killing Germans, but not under these circumstances. We didn't have any arms, you know. We didn't give anything. We didn't have any means. You say, if you want a gun, go down and shoot your German and get his gun. That was the rule in our area. So we went on an expedition to a town through the mountains, which is well known, Saint-Étienne, which is the center in France of armament manufacture. We broke in. I remember the poor guard who was trembling. We shot a few in a pond there to scare him, and he said, don't touch me, I will do what you want. And we filled up 2 cars with guns. We even loaded a 75 millimeter cannon on a truck, an American truck. My brother and I drove back.
In June 1944, the Allied armies landed and the liberation of France was underway. Not only were the American, British, and Free French armies swarming over France, but also the French resistance forces began uprisings and sabotage against the Germans. In Paris, resistance fighters played a key role in the liberation of the city. By the end of August, Paris was liberated, and by May 1945, Berlin fell to the Soviet forces, the Nazis collapsed, the war in Europe ended. Henry and his brother returned home and found his family had survived, but 3 in-laws had been murdered by the Nazis. He secured a temporary job surveying the destroyed village of Dortan. After that, he was employed by the Franco-American Bell Telephone Company, but because of housing and other problems, he immigrated to Canada in 1948. There he secured a job as a surveyor on a dam in the wilderness. He stayed on that job for about 6 months. He liked that in the wilderness, and then was transferred to Toronto, where he was married and started to raise a family. In 1957, he immigrated to the United States.
Being torn between 2 good things, helping your own family who was in danger and making some sense out of your life. We tried to compromise between the 2. So I do not consider myself being a hero. I tried to survive and I tried to make sense out of life. Perhaps we did more than the average Frenchman did. But that's about how I feel about it.
L'autre côté de la rue.